Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Emily Quarles-Mowrer, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Pottstown. So welcome to all of you in this month, which we associate so closely with love and chocolate, to a service which is about times one. Welcome on this unseasonably warm February morning when we have a lot of choices of things you could be doing other than sitting here, but we are so glad that you chose to come and sit with us. This morning, we are once again reminded of the blessings care and community that allow us to gather safely together, and the blessings of technology that allow us to gather in spirit, even when we can't gather in body. This morning, we have music played by the lovely Quarles-Mowrer. We also have a special performance by the choir. And we'd like to send a shout out to Rick Dusty for being our technology lead. Thank you so much. So right now is the time for an announcement. Oh, sorry, I forgot an entire section. For over 50 years, the UUFP has been a liberal religious voice in the Pottstown area. As UUs, we believe that facts and faith are not an either-or proposition. We believe that we can and should honor the wisdom of the past, even as we acknowledge that the past doesn't have all the answers, and that the ways we honor the past, one of the ways we honor the past, is by learning from it rather than repeating it. I think that there are still plenty of questions to explore, and we encourage people to explore into the future. But perhaps most importantly, we believe that no one is outside the circle of justice and compassion. We hope that your spirit and your heart and your mind are refreshed as we commit ourselves once again to our 7 guiding principles. We come together this Sunday morning and every single morning because we share a promise to support one another on our spiritual journeys. Our services are really different each week, but the loving kindness we offer one another in this community is always present. Whoever you are, wherever you are, whomever you love, we are so glad you chose to be with us today. And now we have a moment for announcements. So if you have an announcement, please come on up, use one of the microphones, and remember to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mary. I have 2, and since this is the one I forget the most, I'm going to say it first. A couple of months ago, a few months ago, give or take, I had said, we are welcome to have all voices come up and speak at our lovely podium. And so if you've got a message that is just screaming to be let out, we have some openings in April. So if you could see me, and we'll help you put it together. It could be the whole thing, it could be one piece. It's totally up to you. Second announcement is from the board meeting yesterday. As you know, our sign that said UUFP up there, UUF Pottstown, kind of had an accident. It met an unhappy end with the telephone pole, which also met an unhappy end. So we're taking submissions for new designs. The repurposed Redner's box is in the back, and you can submit your design. It must be anonymous. All of this is going to be anonymously. We're going to take them through, I believe, March 6th, 17th, 18th, somewhere in there. And what we're going to do then is the same way we handle doing our new logo. We're going to put it up to a vote of the fellowship. Again, anonymous voting. You'll get a piece of paper, you check off, and we'll see what happens as we go. Don't ask any detailed questions about ties. We'll figure that out as we go. But in order for everything to be fair, we want it to be anonymous. And the other thing we said, if you can't draw, you could find a picture or something and say, hey, I think this one would be kind of cool. You could say, if we could do something similar to this, it would be no electronic signs. We don't have the money. So we want something just, that fits in our area, that looks nice and neat and all. So I hope that covers it. If it didn't, Linda's in the back.
Hi, I'm Monica. We had our first women's meeting on Friday at lunchtime, and our second women's club meeting is going to be Thursday evening, this coming week from 7:30 to 8:30. So if you'd like to come, please come.
Hi, I'm Miranda, and I'm representing the membership committee today. We are continuing with our sessions of UU 101 and 102. That is part of the past membership here, but it's also just nice for information. We'll be doing this in March, and it will be some Sunday in March after the Sunday service. And we haven't set a date because we want to know who's interested in coming and when you can be here, because we'll pick the date that's best for the most people. The program will be both in person, and if necessary, we can do it via Zoom at the same time, or at another time. So, because I can always just do a separate session for someone that can't make it. So consider joining us. And if you would like to join us, let me know that, or let Kay know. Kay is one of the members of the membership committee. Monica is a member of the membership committee, and Linda Palais is a member. She is later younger. Okay, thanks. Join us.
I'm Linda, and I will be placing it in order for giant cards and so if you need a giant card, let me know. For those of you who don't know, it's a real easy fundraiser for us. If you were to buy, as an example, we get 5% for all of the purchases of the giant card. So how it would work is if you want a $100 giant card, you pay the UUFP $100. We only pay giant $95. So we get $5 off of that transaction. You still have $100 worth of giant. It can be food, gas, wine, beer, whatever that you can buy a giant. It's good. So please let me know if you would like one for the month of March. Thank you.
Righty. Now we'll move to our chalice lighting. We light our chalice this morning with the words of Katie Romano Griffin. Come, let us enter this space of hope and community. Come, let us enter this space with our joys, our sorrows, our passion, and our compassion. Come, let us enter this space with the stories of our ancestors, for their strength and wisdom beats in our hearts too. Come into this space present to the beloved companions who move beside us. Come into this space mindful that together we are building a future for future generations. Come into this space and let us worship. Now, even in this time where technology is so vital in providing us connection, it can still distract us from one another. So at this point, I'd like to remind you to put your notifications on silent, and then I'll invite you to take a moment, take a breath, to rest your eyes, and to listen to the sound of the chime. I'm pretty sure I say this every time I'm up there, but it amazes me how one small action can reverberate for such a long time. Our opening words this morning are by Reese Williams. Spirit of life, come to us to break down barriers, to widen horizons, to make us less judgmental. Help us to see the larger picture and the kinder conclusion, to love and let live, to embrace and forgive, to sustain and care. Help us to reach out to our better selves that we may love more and hate less, to care more and reject less, that bound together by understanding, we may sustain each other through trial and tribulation, joy and happiness, sickness and health. Help us, O God, to be joined in a common purpose of hope and fulfillment. Renew and revive us. We seek a common holy ground for one and all. Now we'll join in our first hymn of the day. It's number 30 from the Gray Hymnal Singing Living Tradition. It's Over My Head. This is an African-American spiritual. Actually, all the hymns this morning are African-American spirituals. They all share a common way of being sung, where you sing the first phrase and you sing the same words over and over again, just with different tunes. It's like a call and response. And then there's like a final thing that brings it all together. So we're going to sing all, I believe we're singing all 5 verses. Although if the verses suddenly cut out on the slideshow, then I was wrong. We are doing good. And it is time for a story. Whether you are young in body or in spirit, you're welcome to join us at the front of the sanctuary.
That's all right.
I wanted to try this. There we go. So, oh, there we go. Try it this way. So I didn't play this. Okay. So Emily and I were both sick last week, so trying to keep our distance. Okay. Okay. So, have any of you heard of the movie Hidden Figures? Yeah. Yeah. So the Hidden Figures was based on a book, a wonderful book, about 4 women who worked at NASA. And it wasn't even always called NASA when they first started working there. It had a different name. But this is an absolutely beautiful picture book based on the story of those 4 women. It is quite a long book, so I will be abridging it somewhat. Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden were good at math. Really good. In 1943, the United States was at war, World War II. Dorothy Vaughan wanted to serve her country by working for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the government agency that designed airplanes. NACA is what became NASA later. Having the best airplanes would help America win the war. Making airplanes fly faster and higher and safer meant doing lots of tests at the agency's Langley Laboratory in Hampton, Virginia. Tests meant numbers, numbers meant math, and math meant computers. Today, we think of computers as machines. But in the 1940s, computers were actual people, like Dorothy, Mary, Katherine, and Christine. Their job was to do math. All day, they did calculations, and they were called computers. That was the name of their job. Because Dorothy was Black and a woman, some people thought it would be impossible for her to get a job as a computer. She lived in Virginia, a southern state where laws segregated or kept apart Black people and white people. They could not eat in the same restaurants. They could not drink from the same water fountains. They could not use the same restrooms. They could not attend the same schools. They could not play on the same sports teams. They could not sit near each other in movie theaters. They could not marry someone of a different race. But Dorothy didn't think it was impossible. She was good at math, really good. She knew she was the right person for the job. She applied, and the laboratory offered her a position as a computer. But at work, Blacks and whites were kept apart. The white computers worked in one building, and Dorothy and the other Black computers worked in a different building in their separate office. Even though they worked on the same kinds of assignments, the Black computers and white computers used separate bathrooms and ate in separate lunchrooms. America won the war in 1945, but Dorothy stayed on the job, still trying to make airplanes faster and safer. So at this point, I am going to describe briefly some of the other women. So Dorothy Vaughan was the first Black computer to work at NACA. Later, Mary Jackson started working there. She also got a job as a computer at Langley, which was where NACA was. But Mary Jackson didn't want to just be a computer. She wanted to be an engineer. The only problem was the engineering classes were at a high school, a white high school, where Black students weren't allowed to go. But she worked and pushed until they let her take classes there. And she became the first Black engineer to work at NACA. The next person in here, Katherine Johnson, is also really, really good at math. Katherine Johnson also worked with the engineers who were making the planes faster and safer. Eventually, so Katherine Johnson also started working on the first manned space flight. She was one of the people doing the math for John Glenn, who was the first American to orbit the Earth. Without her math, his rocket would not have been able to orbit the Earth safely and land safely. She pushed and pushed and pushed until they let her work with them, because not only the Black computers couldn't work with them, but also women weren't even allowed in those engineering meetings at that time. So she had to push to be the first to go. Then I'm gonna jump here. Okay. So I'm gonna, you know what? Okay, I'm gonna jump ahead. So this is John Glenn. He's the astronaut. He was the first American to orbit the Earth. No one was better than Katherine at solving these tricky math problems. Days before his mission, John Glenn wanted Katherine, only Katherine, to double check the machine's computer trajectory calculations to make sure that they hadn't made any mistakes. When Katherine said the numbers correct, he was ready to go. On February 20th, 1962, he blasted off into space, circled the Earth, and made his way home safely. The last person in here, Christine Darden, was also a very talented mathematician. She didn't come work there until 1967, I believe. And that was right around the time that NACA, which was now called NASA, wanted to try sending men to the moon. So the people at the laboratory prepared for years to send astronauts to the moon, about 238,900 miles away from Earth. Finally, on July 20th, 1969, the world watched as the three men arrived at the moon in their Apollo 11 spacecraft. Do you remember these famous words? Have you heard this? That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, said astronaut Neil Armstrong when he stepped onto the dusty surface. But it was also a giant leap for Dorothy, Mary, Catherine, Christine, and all of the other computers and engineers who had worked at the laboratory over the years. The moon landing was a success from takeoff to splashdown, but there was no time to rest. Once NASA landed astronauts on the moon, the people at the laboratory began dreaming of sending humans to other planets such as Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. We haven't gotten there yet, but maybe someday. They started to imagine hyper-fast space planes that could travel around the Earth at 7 times the speed of sound. The next adventure wouldn't be easy and would require lots of tests and lots more numbers. But Dorothy, Mary, Catherine, and Christine knew one thing. With hard work, perseverance, and a love of math, anything was possible. It's a great story. If you want to read the whole thing on your own, learn more about these amazing women. Thank you.
I just want to intrude a bit. Chris, our treasurer, at my request, has developed a lovely set of diagrams which will detail, without giving numbers, our financial status, which you can all review to see if they're agreeable to you. The good news is all those nice little lines are either above or where they should be in terms of our finances. So I had to add that as we take very offering. Thank you, everybody.
Yes. The spirit of trust and generosity we gratefully accept this morning. Thank you. All right, and now the choir has prepared a really awesome anthem for you all. And I'm so sorry I don't get to participate this time because, as before mentioned, I was sick and it's not good for me to be near people.
I just wanted to quickly announce that this piece is by Duke Ellington, and he was an amazing composer, one of the greatest, and he knew a ton about classical music and jazz music, and he really did an amazing job of bringing them together. And he was a pianist, a composer, he directed his own orchestra, and also worked in the film industry. So I hope you enjoyed this piece.
It's beautiful, guys. Our reading this morning is Retracing My Steps. It's by Dr. Glenn Thomas Rideout, and it's a part of, the UUA has this series of personal essays that they publish. You can actually get them in a digest that comes to your email. And this one spoke to me because, like him, I had also done an ancestry project at school. So he starts it with a quote. "If you don't seek it, you won't see it. I'm going to build my own foundation. You won't break my soul." Anybody recognize that? It's Queen Bey, Beyonce? Yeah. When it was his turn to present his history project to our 7th grade class, he began with delight, flashing a large poster board and permanent marker family tree. He'd been able to trace his ancestors back to the 1500s. I wondered how he was able to discover so much in so many. I tried something like that the year before. I'd asked every adult in my family. I stayed in the local library for so long they gave me a job at the desk. I combed the internet looking for something of my deeper heritage so that I could imagine myself. He was talking about his German ancestors. I remember feeling confusion. I had no idea where he was getting this information about his great-great-great-grandparents. I looked around me. None of the other Black kids in the classroom seemed to have a clue either. We don't really have those stories. Ultimately, I realized that my white classmate had access to a time that I didn't have. He had access to stories and connections that I would never have. Like most Black people, I rise on the shoulders of ancestors whose names I cannot know. Our ability to move through our own past is encumbered, cut off at the point where we as human beings are sold like cargo. It's the point of erasure. In order to shackle people to ships, you have to untether them from their life stories and their heritage and their bloodlines and their lands and their homes. You do all this untethering for the rest of the generations of that person. For the rest of time, there will be no knowing of those stories. If from the beginning of racism and this human trafficking, the point was to build a country with people imprisoned and kept in their economic states, then the only way for America, for all of her people to get any sort of free together is to act as if these stolen stories truly exist, to replace habits that encumber the movement and liberation of our kindred, to remember even lives for which we have no names. We show our children now the the truths of yesterday and the possibilities of tomorrow. It's a deeper connection with a greater living story that brings a chance of wellness and repair for all of us. He ends it with a prayer. He says, God, continue to fashion my people in our ancestors' image so that we may glimpse their stories in each other's eyes and trace over the marks of erasure in bold, provocative joy. And now we'll play hymn number 212. We are dancing Sarah's Circle. We're singing the rhythm tradition. I forgot to warn everybody. So, voices of the past. So this is sort of more of a book report than my usual sermons. I have 4 stories for you this morning, and they are all primarily from Mark Morrison Reed's. Mark Morrison Reed is a prominent UU minister and theologian and historian. And he, in 2014, wrote a book called Darkening the Doorways, Black Trailblazers and Missed Opportunities in Unitarian Universalism. So this book is a compilation of a bunch of essays by different people who put together primary sources to come up with stories of different people. And it's stories of Unitarians, it's stories of Universalists, it's stories of Unitarian Universalists. But this morning I took just stories about Unitarians. You say saving some for later, because I might want to do something about it some other time. So we're going to start with Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, which I know Miss Lisa is very familiar with. She did a program on Frances Ellen Hopkins. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. She's 4 names, it's difficult. And this particular essay was by Hiyama Raman. And so I'm just saying that right at the beginning so you know that the words are not exactly the way she wrote them, but a lot of the information comes directly from her. So to recap, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was born to free Black parents in Maryland, and her parents died while she was young. Her mother died when she was 3, and her father died not long after. So she was actually raised by her abolitionist uncle, William Watkins, who founded the Academy for Negro Youth, which was a school for Negroes because, she was born before the Civil War. She was educated until the age of 13, at which point she had to leave and become a housekeeper and a seamstress. And while she was being a housekeeper and a seamstress, she was also writing, and she published a book of poetry in 1846. Now, she went on to work in 6 different fields in her life. She worked 5 fields in social justice. So she worked on abolitionism, she worked on suffrage, she worked on temperance, she worked on children's rights, she worked in the women's movement as a whole, and she also worked in the literary movement. She published several books. She published poetry, she published novels, she published speeches. And she married Benton Harper, and they were only married for a few years, about 6 years. And he died in 1866. Now, he died in a little bit of debt, and rather than allow her to keep some of the things that she could make money with, she had been like taking in washing and working as a seamstress and making butter for, I believe she lived in Cleveland, so making butter for the Cleveland farmers markets. They repossessed everything she owned, except for, I believe, a mirror and a feather bed. And later, like a little bit after they repossessed everything, so she couldn't make a living anymore, one of her neighbors, who actually owed her $5, said that she had stolen from him, and he repossessed her feather bed. So she had nothing. She had nothing. She had 4 stepchildren and 1 natural child, and she couldn't take care of any of them. She had to send her stepchildren to live with her husband's family, and then she had to send her daughter Mary to live with her kin. And the way that she kept body and soul together for those years was she went on a tour of various states in the South and gave speeches, and she had a merch table where she sold her books, she sold her poetry. And that is how she kept body and soul together for about 6 grueling years. And I can't imagine, because she was traveling through southern states right before the Civil War, giving speeches about how people should treat one another as equals. So after these grueling years of touring, she was able to settle in Philadelphia with her daughter, Mary, where she became a member of the Unitarian Church on Chestnut Street. And it's interesting because her membership of the Unitarian Church was documented through pew rental payments, which I think that's really funny, because that's a thing that used to happen. People would rent the pew that they would sit in. And there's not really a lot of documentation that she actually attended services, because she also was a member of Bethel AME Church, where both she and her daughter taught Sunday school. And she worked with another church, Reverend L. Phillips Church of the Crucifixion. She worked with him on juvenile delinquency, and with the Sarah Allen Missionary Association on feeding the hungry. So it seems that even though her heart and her soul and her beliefs were the Unitarian Universalist, she didn't attend that church except as pew rentals. And then when she died, she was actually buried by the minister there. So that's where her service was. So just an example of what she believed in, what she would go around to the South speaking. This is from her 1866 speech, We Are All Bound Up Together. Now, she gave this speech at the women's movement. Where was that? Why would I have written that down? But she gave this at a women's movement speech, which was up in upstate New York. She said, "We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse in its own soul. You tried that in the case of the Negro. You pressed him down for 2 centuries, and in doing so, you crippled the moral strength and paralyzed the spiritual energies of the white men of the country. When the hands of the Black were fettered, white men were deprived of the liberty of speech and freedom of the press. Society cannot afford to neglect the enlightenment of any of its members. At the South, the legislation of the country was in behalf of the rich slaveholders, while the poor white man was neglected. What is the consequence today? From that very class of neglected and poor white men comes the man who stands today with his hand upon the helm of the nation. If he fails to catch the watchword of the hour and throws himself, the incarnation of meanness, across the pathway of the nation, my objection to Andrew Johnson is not that he has been a poor white man. My objection is that he keeps his poor white all the way through." I think that's just an interesting, and that's something you hear today, actually. That's an interesting perspective that has been keeping on through the ages. So the next story I wanted to bring you was Peter Humphreys Clark. This one is an essay by Bruce Beisner. Now, Peter Humphreys Clark, he was mixed race. His paternal grandmother, Betty, had been enslaved to his paternal grandfather, John Clark, in Kentucky. And after John Clark's death, Betty and her children were freed, and they moved from the slave state of Kentucky right across the river to Cincinnati in the free state of Ohio. And this was something that happened a lot, actually, in this particular time period. Cincinnati was known as a big free city because it was right across the river. It was the very first city you come to when you cross the river out of Kentucky. Now, Clark's father, Michael Clark, was a successful barber. So this is Betty's son. He was a successful barber, and he was also the founder of the Colored Orphan Asylum of Cincinnati. And this was an asylum for orphaned Black children. So Michael Clark, Peter Clark's father, knew the value of education. So he educated Peter Humphreys Clark. He stuck him in all the private schools, and then he got him an apprenticeship at a print shop that was owned by a white abolitionist. Unfortunately, that print shop was sold, and the new owner did not want to have any Black people on the premises, so he had to be let go. And then in 1849, Clark's uncle and good friend, John Gaines, successfully petitioned the Ohio legislature to establish the state's first colored high school, which came to be called the Gaines High School. Clark was hired as the first African-American teacher at that school. However, in 1852, the white Board of Education insisted that he be dismissed because he publicly praised the ideas of Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine was a famous Unitarian thinker. Now, Clark was an abolitionist. He edited and published the newsletter of the Ohio Convention of Colored Men, as well as publishing his own newspaper. So the Herald of Freedom, that was his newspaper. So after he was dismissed, he moved to Rochester, New York, and he worked with Frederick Douglass. Everyone knows Frederick Douglass. And he was an assistant editor to Frederick Douglass's newspaper. Some people say it was the North Star. Some people say it was just the Frederick Douglass newspaper because different stories. And the newspaper was actually published out of the basement of the Memorial AME Zion Church. So churches were really involved in abolition. Clark joined the National Convention of Colored Men and made abolitionist speeches throughout the Midwest. So around 1857, Clark was rehired by the Gaines School in Cincinnati. They were like, oh, we made a mistake. And he became friends at this time with Alphonso Taft and George Hoadley, who were some prominent white attorneys in Cincinnati. They were members of Cincinnati's first Congregational Unitarian Church. And Clark agreed with the abolitionist sermons he heard. He agreed with the theology he heard in the sermons, and he became that church's first Black member in 1868. He even represented the congregation at the National Convention of Unitarian Churches in New York City in 1871. But this is interesting. They wouldn't have an additional Black member until 1952. Clark was very involved in the political causes of the day. He actually got his friend George Hoadley, the same George Hoadley who recommended him to his job. Well, he got George Hoadley elected as the first Democratic governor of Ohio since the end of the Civil War. Hoadley repealed Ohio's Black laws. And if you guys have heard about the Black laws, they're basically the same kind of laws that they had in segregation itself, except that they were laws that were all over the country. But Hoadley repealed those, and he appointed Black leaders to state offices, including appointing Clark as the first Black trustee of the Ohio State University. So this is a quote directly from Beisner's piece that I thought was really interesting. In an 1885 letter to President Grover Cleveland, the then Ohio governor, George Hoadley, said of his friend Peter Clark, "His color has kept him in the shadows. But even a white man, there is no position in the state to which he might not have aspired." It's just amazing. Okay, story number 3. Clarence Bertrand Thompson. This story was written by John Burns. And this story, again, starts going way back to the ancestors because, you know, we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. So Thompson's father, James Beauregard Thompson, was a freeborn colored man who family lore said was the grandson of Napoleon's brother Jerome Bonaparte and an unnamed colored. And Thompson's mother, Medora Gertrude Reed, was the child of a white Virginia slaveholder and a slave of Native American and African American ancestry. And they met in Boston, where James Beauregard was apprenticed to a jeweler. Now, the Thompsons were part of the social circle of the Boston Unitarians. Clarence Thompson's older sister Beatrice was actually named Beatrice Sumner Thompson after U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, a Unitarian abolitionist that they were friendly with, who attended her christening. But whatever happened in Boston, they didn't go into it. The Thompsons ended up moving out of Boston and went west to Denver, where James Thompson worked as a railway porter rather than a jeweler. So you can think that that might have been a little bit of a, you know, downward spiral in the family's history. James Thompson and Medora Thompson actually got divorced, which this was in the early 1900s. So that was a big deal. And Medora moved 8-year-old Clarence out to Los Angeles, even further west. Well, at the urging of his mother, Clarence decided he was going to get through his education as quickly as possible. He finished his high school at 15. And then in 1900, he was age of 18. He graduated from the University of Southern California's School of Law. Now, you can't practice law at 18, you have to be 21. So he studied and taught French, and he studied and taught piano, and he wrote newspaper articles to keep body and soul together until he could start practicing law, at which point he pretty much decided to stop practicing law because he found it to be kind of, what did he call it? He said something along the lines of, it's a very disagreeable way to make my living. So, but at 22, while he was still out there in California, Thompson became a part of a transcendentalist group called the Fellowship. Now, this fellowship could have been an early precursor to the 1960s fellowship movement in the Unitarian Universalist Association. They had classes, their new membership classes studied Emerson. That's what they did. And at this place, Clarence Thompson was elected as an assistant minister. Now, he ended up leaving California and applying to Harvard to study sociology and economics in the fall of 1905. And he also, at the same time, applied for and received an AUA ministerial Association of Unitarian Churches ministerial fellowship, becoming the first African American to do so. Although I do have to say, there's not really any proof that they knew he was African American when they approved him. The terms didn't reflect race; they reflected class and hope for a society of equals. And there isn't a whole lot of information about whether or not they actually knew about his heritage. So in 1907, he was engaged to Maureen Kennedy, who was a white woman of prominent background. Her cousin, James M. Cox, was the governor of Ohio in 1920. And then he became the 1920 Republican candidate for US president. Now, at the point where they got engaged, there was a little bit of whispering about his possible mixed-race heritage. And there was some contention in that Peabody Unitarian Church. He ended up leaving the Peabody Unitarian Church just a couple years after he married his white wife. So he resigned in 1909. And after resigning from the church, he decided that he was going to, well, I don't know if he decided or if he ended up having to work unloading trucks. Because one of the things he wrote a lot about the worker, and he was kind of socialist in his ideals, and he he had a theory of management that said that managers and workers should be partners and should really try to work together to make each company succeed, which, I mean, that sounds like something that is completely modern in its thinking, but back then it was kind of revolutionary. So he was working, he had never been an actual wage earning worker, so he decided to do that job to see if his management techniques would apply in real life. And we don't know what happened, but he was invited to take a teaching position at the newly formed Harvard School of Business Administration by then Dean Edward Gay. He was later offered a full professorship, but he declined and instead consulted abroad and published a bunch of books about economics and management theory. So that's his next career, but he got bored with that apparently, because in 1940, he moved to California and studied biochemistry and the role of enzymes in cancer at UC Berkeley. He was given his own lab, but he retired at age 65, at which point he moved to Uruguay. He kept up a correspondence with his colleagues at Harvard. He kept up scientific papers that he was publishing. He was still publishing tracts about management theory. He was writing to his sister. But when he died in 1969, there seems to have been no real notice of his passing. So John Burens, who is the author of this study of his life, was most upset that this man, who contributed hugely in 4 separate careers, he contributed in law, in religion, in economics, and in biochemistry, has been largely forgotten, and his name has been written out of the history books. So we're going to come to our last story for this morning. This is Fanny Barrier Williams, and I chose her to be last because I feel the most kinship with her. Like me, she grew up in a white suburb of a bigger city in upstate New York. And like me, she didn't see much discrimination in her early years. However, unlike me, once she knew about discrimination, she did a whole lot about it. Of the 4 pioneers I covered today, she's the person I hope most to someday be able to emulate. So Fanny Barrier was born in 1855, so that's about 10 years before the Civil War, in Brockport, New York. Brockport is a really small town that's just a little bit west of Rochester. So I grew up in Buffalo, and you have to like pass through on the 90. You have to pass through Brockport to get to Rochester. And the reason I know that, actually, like I grew up knowing that because my mom, when she studied ministry, she actually went to school in Rochester. So like about every other weekend, I would have to be in the car with mom driving up to, it's like an hour and a half. But okay, so Fanny Barrier, she and her sister and brother were the only African-American children in their public school. However, despite being born prior to the Civil War, she grew up mostly sheltered from racism. She was popular with her teachers and her classmates, and she was an artist and musician, and she was the first African-American to graduate from Brockport State Normal School, which was their local SUNY school. It's now called SUNY Brockport, State University of New York. She decided that she could best serve the world by becoming a teacher in the Freedmen Bureau schools that were established in the southern states during Reconstruction. So you can imagine, Wikipedia places her at a school in Hannibal, Missouri. And you can imagine what it must have been like for her to go from being, you know, not even having to really think about the color of her skin because maybe she was the only Black person in town, but you know, everyone knew who she was and everyone treated her just normal, just like a regular person. She went from that to being a Black person in the South. And she was shocked and disheartened by the treatment. Edwards describes one particular instance where she was on a train and she was in a car that was segregated, but she was in the wrong part of the segregated car. And she just pretended that she only spoke French. Edwards also describes how she tried to join a painting class because she was really well known for being an excellent musician and a really talented painter while she was up in New York. And she wanted to join a painting class while she was down in Missouri. And she finally got someone who would agree to teach her, but they put up a screen in between her and all the other kids in the class, all the other students, because they didn't want the other students to feel uncomfortable having to have a Negro in class with them. But the South wasn't the only place where Fanny Barrier faced discrimination. After that particular instance, she left the South. She decided that she was going to go back to the North, where at least the discrimination was not as overt. And she enrolled in the Boston Music Conservatory, studied piano. But she was forced to leave when some of the white Southern students wouldn't have her in class. So she moved to Washington, D.C. Her sister was already teaching in Washington, D.C., so she moved to Washington, D.C. as well, and she taught school. While she was there, she met law student Samuel Lang Williams, whom she married in 1887. And they moved out to Chicago's South Side. Chicago's South Side was the thriving Black community there. And they joined the Unitarian Church of All Souls. So the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago was what brought Fanny Barrier Williams to national prominence. Now, originally, this Columbian Exposition didn't have any Black people at all serving on it, on the board. And so all of the upper class Black ladies in the South Side of Chicago, they all protested and petitioned until they got someone on the board who would be representing their interests, and that person ended up being Fanny. And she was appointed to gather exhibits for the Women's Hall in order to appease the Black women leaders who had protested. She was also given the opportunity to speak, and she gave two famous addresses. One was called The Intellectual Progress of Colored Women of the United States Since the Emancipation Proclamation, and that was she addressed to the World's Congress of Representative Women. And the other was Religious Duty to the Negro, which she gave to the World's Parliament of Religions. So later I'm gonna give you a little clip out of one of those speeches, because it's an interesting story how she used to use the Bible. She would say something like, if people aren't opening the Bible wide enough, they're not going to read what God's word actually is. And I thought that was an interesting way to put it. But another thing that happened in her life, in 1894, Barrier Williams was nominated to the prominent Chicago Women's Club by some of her white friends, including the club's former president, Celia Parker Woolley. Now, she had all the qualifications, like they cared about your class, they cared about your ability to look nice, they cared about all of the social stuff that you were, you have to be involved in a lot of social causes, you have to be a planner of several events, that kind of thing. They wanted to make sure that all of their members were involved and would represent the club well. Well, the only way in which she was not qualified to represent the club was the color of her skin. And there was a 14-month fight to get her into that club. And she did end up being voted in by a strong majority, but several members resigned over it. So it's not strictly about this episode, but about many of the episodes in her life, and especially of the lives of people. She knew she was very privileged. And so one of the things that really got to her was that if this is how people treat me and I am privileged, how are they treating the people without my privilege? She said, whether I live in the North or the South, I cannot be counted at my full value. The Williams were involved in lots of social causes. They were early members of the NAACP. Williams was a founding member of one of the groups that went on to become the National Association of Colored Women, which incidentally also Frances Barrier, the first woman who I talked about who has four names. She was also on that board. Barrier Williams was the only African-American to speak at Susan B. Anthony's eulogy in the 1906 National Suffrage Convention. And she was also the first African-American and the first woman to serve on the board of the Chicago Public Library. So she was a real pioneer. And this is the thought that I wanted to leave you guys with about her. This is from her 1895 talk to African-American women in Memphis, Tennessee. It's from Opportunities and Responsibilities of Colored Women. She said, "Religion should stand more for love than doctrine, more for human worth than church name. What men and women do, rather than what they say or profess, shall be the standard of religion." And y'all can guess why I love that book. It's so Unitarian. So anyhow, that is my book report. And I'm sure there will be another one.
Yeah.
And now we are going to join in singing hymn number 407, "We're Gonna Sit at the Welcome Table." And I love this one because it's just, everybody belongs. Someday everyone will belong. And all the verses. Now, if you'll join me in reading out the child's extinguishing word. We extinguish our child's flame, but not the light of truth, warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and in our hands until we are together again.
On the downside of water here.
We close our online service with a poem from Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes called "I Too." I too sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, "Eat in the kitchen then." Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. He too is welcome at the welcome table. And now we'll sing Spirit of Life, and that'll be the close of the online portion of the service, and we'll go to children's hours after that.